She always believed their love was unbreakable and their marriage fully transparent. But after Richard's sudden passing, Susan discovered a hidden past he never spoke of. A life steeped in Cold War secrets, a letter that altered everything she thought she knew, and a quest for answers that would redefine their entire story. Before we delve into this tale of profound devotion and clandestine sacrifice, let me know where you're tuning in from today, and if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Susan Carter stood in her dimly lit living room, feeling the gentle hum of the old radiator beneath the silent weight of her grief. She had been a teacher for decades, someone who prided herself on steady routines and comforting predictability. But in the week since her husband, Richard, had died from a sudden illness, everything she had ever known felt unmoored. The ticking of the antique mantel clock no longer soothed her. The moonlight through the window cast long shadows, making the house seem both familiar and strangely alien. She thought she had known every corner of Richard's life. His habits, his retired military background, his unwavering love for quiet afternoons reading the newspaper. They'd shared over 40 years of marriage, forging what she believed was an unbreakable bond of trust and understanding. Now, confronted by his death, she discovered that loss was not the only thing haunting her. Her husband's life, especially his time serving during the Cold War, was far more obscured than she had ever realized. A part of her believed that going through Richard's personal belongings might bring comfort, as though she might find him in letters, diaries, or notes. She needed the anchor that came from physically handling the memories they had built together. Yet, as she sifted through his old trunk of military medals, photos, and official papers, she felt an unfamiliar dread tugging at her. For a man who had claimed to be an officer in Army intelligence, she expected a certain straightforward record, maybe even glimpses of classified elements he had vaguely referenced over the years. Instead, the documents were either suspiciously generic or half incomplete. Some forms looked fresh, with no official stamps, no verifying details that one might expect of legitimate service records. Frowning, she spent hours hunched over the trunk, scanning old letters. Many were just short updates he'd written to her from overseas, describing stilted, routine missions. "Everything is fine. Can't say more. I love you," repeated over many months. There was a dryness to them that she had always assumed was due to confidentiality. Now, alone in their living room, she wondered if these letters were illusions. Was there deeper meaning hidden between the lines? She almost dismissed the creeping doubts as overthinking. But her curiosity soon grew too loud to ignore. In a moment of determination, she sent a request for Richard Carter's military records, longing to find clarity about the units he served in, the missions that shaped him, the promotions he earned. She hoped the official record might confirm the stable, heroic narrative of a man who had retired with honor. In the meantime, she turned to the trunk again, sorting dog tags, folded uniforms, old photos. The emotions came in waves. Heartbreak at his absence, a kind of numbness that refused to let her fully cry, and a confused anxiety that perhaps her husband's story was not at all what he had told her. Days later, she woke early to a crisp sunrise. Her phone buzzed, alerting her to an email from the National Personnel Records Center. She eagerly opened it, heart fluttering with hope, only to read the devastating line: "We have no record of a Richard Carter serving in the United States Army or any related branch." At first, she refused to believe it. She double-checked the requested details, spelled everything as she had known them for decades, but no match. The email recommended verifying that Susan had the correct details about her husband or exploring further. She reread it multiple times, mind reeling, her heart hammering. This could not be correct. She had pictures of Richard in uniform, official letters that spoke of his rank. How could there be no record at all? Bewildered and angry, she rummaged more intently through his trunk, determined to find proof she could present. She found a worn photo of him in what appeared to be Army attire, but the uniform insignia was partially obscured by glare. She discovered old travel documents for visits to Europe, including West Germany, apparently from his deployments in the Cold War era. Yet the deeper she searched, the more holes she saw. The supposed official forms had odd wording or no official stamps. The medals included no standard documentation. Her mind spun, Could the entire story he had told her about his service have been built on half-truths? The next day, still in shock, she decided to systematically go through every item. She carefully laid them out on the dining table, ordering them chronologically as best she could. At times, she felt physically ill, remembering how Richard used to gently hush her questions whenever she asked about specifics of his Cold War missions. He had said it was all classified, that even he barely knew details. She had trusted him. They had built a family, a life, anchored by daily rhythms. Now it felt as though she were rummaging through a stranger's past. Hour by hour, she catalogued each medal, each letter, each photograph. The silence in the house pressed upon her. By evening, she ached with confusion and dread. On the third day of her search, she pulled out a battered old box from the trunk's bottom. Within it was a folder containing more suspicious documents, some half in Czech, some in English. She recognized no official letterhead. Then, at the bottom, she found something that made her heart skip. A tattered, faded passport from the 1960s. The photograph was undeniably Richard's younger face. The same strong brow, the same serious expression she had come to love. But the name on it read Daniel Novak. The nationality indicated Czechoslovakia. Her mouth went dry. The place of birth was Prague. The birth date didn't match the one she had always known for Richard Carter. She sat trembling, staring at the passport, trying to rationalize how this could possibly belong to her husband. Was it part of an undercover operation? Could it be that he had stolen an enemy's identity as part of some intelligence gambit? Or worse, was the entire persona of Richard Carter a fabricated identity? Susan's mind whirled with theories, each more unsettling. She paced the living room, passport in hand, tears threatening to overtake her. Decades of marriage, the man she thought she knew intimately, now unraveling before her. She weighed the possibility that maybe he had been a deep-cover agent. But then why not leave her some note or explanation? Perhaps he had tried to protect her by burying the truth. She recalled small hints she'd once overlooked. The time she found him quietly burning some letters in the fireplace, or how he insisted on paying exclusively in cash for certain travel arrangements. She had never questioned them deeply. Now she felt naive. She began to weep, thinking how the last words he spoke on his deathbed were, "I'm so sorry, Susan." Words she had presumed were about leaving her alone in old age. Maybe they were about something else entirely. 2 sleepless nights later, she could bear it no more. She booked a flight to Prague. If Daniel Novak truly originated there, if that passport was legitimate, perhaps the city would hold answers. She told her grown son that she needed time alone to process his father's death and glean closure, leaving out the disturbing details. She arrived in Prague on a brisk morning, stepping out of the airport into a city that felt both magical and haunted by its past. The Czech language soared around her, a tapestry of vowels and hushed consonants. She checked into a modest guest house near the city center, the antique lamps and creaky floors reminding her of the architecture Richard used to praise whenever they watched documentaries about Eastern Europe. Her first step was to visit the National Archives, requesting records on Daniel Novak. She braced for bureaucracy, forming her sentences carefully in a mixture of English and halting Czech phrases she'd hastily learned. The archivist, sympathetic to her plight, helped search. Indeed, they found references to a Daniel Novak, a Czech diplomat once accused of espionage in the late 1960s, rumored to have vanished. The official stance was that Novak had defected to the West during the Prague Spring crackdown in 1968. She absorbed these facts with a pounding heart, remembering how Richard claimed to have served around that time in intelligence. Was it possible he encountered Novak? The archivist said Novak was never found. Many assumed he had changed his name or been captured. They had no closure. Susan felt her head spin, adding a new dimension. Could Richard have been Daniel Novak after all? Or was the real Novak a different man, and Richard had something to do with his disappearance? In a swirl of anxious determination, she delved deeper, seeking out retired intelligence officers, rummaging through old newspapers on microfilm, collecting scraps of rumor about Novak. The city's labyrinthine past made it both frustrating and enthralling. She discovered partial references to a diplomat who vanished under suspicious circumstances. Some whispered that Novak was a double agent playing both sides. Others claimed he was murdered by a close associate. Each lead raised her tension. She walked the cobbled streets of Prague in a daze, passing Baroque facades, crossing the Vltava River, glimpsing the spires of the castle. She saw couples strolling, tourists snapping photos, all while she carried the heartbreak of suspecting her husband was entangled in some dark clandestine deed. One chilly afternoon, in the reading room of an old library near Wenceslas Square, she found a battered newspaper clipping from late 1968. It described how Daniel Novak had last been seen in a cafe with a fellow Czech intelligence figure, then disappeared. The authorities suspected defection. But another piece suggested a body was discovered, unidentifiable, possibly Novak's. The story was overshadowed by the Soviet invasion and widespread turmoil. She read until her eyes burned. If Novak was indeed killed, then who took his identity, if that identity truly was used? She dreaded the possibility that Richard Carter had been that figure, not an intelligence hero but a murderer. She stared at a photo in the clipping. Novak's face resembled Richard's younger self. Subtle differences in the jawline, but close enough that, with some cunning, a person might pass them off as the same man. Susan felt physically ill at the notion. That night, in her modest hotel, she turned the passport over and over in her hands. She tried to recall every conversation she and Richard had about his past. He had always evaded details, claiming security clearances forbade him from talking. She used to find it romantic, a hint of James Bond mystique. Now she only felt betrayed. She rummaged her phone for any clue from family archives. She realized no one in Richard's family could confirm his early childhood. He always said his parents died when he was young. She never pressed. Had that, too, been a lie? She wept for the man she had loved, uncertain if he was a monster or a misunderstood hero. The next day, she followed a lead from an ex-spy turned Cold War historian named Yuri. She found him in a dimly lit apartment building near the city outskirts, reeking of old cigarettes and dust. Yuri was a wiry man in his 70s, suspicious at first, until she showed him the passport. He recognized the name Daniel Novak immediately. He said Novak was rumored to have tried to smuggle out top-secret documents about a planned crackdown on dissidents. Yuri believed someone in Novak's inner circle betrayed him. The name Richard Carter rang no bell for him, but he stated that if Carter indeed was the murderer, then he must have been an operative himself, maybe from the American side or a different Czech faction. Susan felt torn. Was her husband the betrayer or the betrayed? Yuri suggested she look into old security files at a restricted state archive. He gave her the name of a contact who might get her partial access. The contact, a pale archivist in a cramped office, let her see heavily redacted files from the late 1960s. She found references to Novak's planned defection, how he feared one of his associates was actually working for Moscow, not for the West. Then there was an abrupt mention of Novak eliminated, no further details in an internal note. She nearly dropped the page. Reading further, she saw speculation that the killer had possibly stolen Novak's identity, using it to slip into the West. The official file ended in incomplete fashion, as if the entire operation was hushed. She closed her eyes, reeling. If this was all accurate, then her beloved Richard was that man, the killer, slipping away under Novak's name, eventually forging new papers as Richard Carter. The heartbreak and revulsion churned her stomach. She left the archive dizzy, stumbling onto the street. Prague's romantic beauty stood at stark odds with the horror in her heart. 2 days passed in a blur of despair. She roamed the city aimlessly, appetite gone, sleep tortured by nightmares of Richard standing over a body, stealing documents from a dead man's coat. She realized she had to step back, breathe, and weigh the puzzle carefully. If it was that straightforward, Richard or an ally had killed Novak, why would he keep souvenirs like the battered passport? Could it be a trophy or a guilt-ridden relic? Or was there a more complicated story, one where Richard wasn't the villain? She tried to trust her old instincts about his gentle character. She recalled how lovingly he always cared for her and their children, how protective he was. Could a murderer be so tender in everyday life? She found small glimmers of hope that maybe the story was not as it seemed. Or perhaps some men compartmentalized monstrous deeds. On her final day in Prague, exhausted from the mental toll, she decided to head to the airport, resolved to share this horrifying suspicion with no one. She would bury it. She sat at a small cafe near Old Town Square, sipping a coffee despite her swirling thoughts. The air smelled of fresh pastries, the city swirling with tourists. Suddenly, an impeccably dressed older man with a thick Czech accent approached her table. He gently placed a folded photograph on the table. She recognized Richard's face in the photo, wearing a foreign uniform, flanked by men in unmarked attire. Shocked, she stared up at the man's piercing eyes. He quietly said, "We never stopped watching." Her mind reeled. She asked who he was. He said his name was unimportant. He was an old colleague of Richard's from the intelligence days, someone who had quietly followed the story of Novak. Susan's heart pounded. She demanded to know if Richard truly had killed Novak. The man took a seat, his voice measured, explaining that the official story was twisted. Novak had not been the man Susan thought. He was a brilliant but compromised figure, entangled with dangerous factions. Richard, operating under orders from Western intelligence, was forced to intervene, saving countless lives from a planned assassination plot. Novak died, the man acknowledged, but the circumstances were more complicated. Richard had no choice but to assume Novak's identity to flee a net of retribution from Soviet allies who wanted them both dead. He said Richard spent his entire life afterwards burdened by secrets he could never reveal, not even to Susan. At first, Susan refused to believe it. She repeated the official archives that said Novak was just a victim of betrayal. The man calmly repeated that the archives only told partial truths. He insisted Richard had been a double agent, risking everything to foil a catastrophic plot. If he had not stepped in, many innocents would have died. The man's voice trembled with conviction as he recounted a rumor that Richard personally destroyed crucial infiltration documents Novak had. The man admitted Richard's final step, adopting the identity of a presumed defector, bought him enough time to vanish from all radars. "He saved me," the man whispered, eyes moist. "He saved so many. Then he had to vanish or they'd have killed him too. He chose a quiet life in your country." The name Richard Carter might have been one of many false identities. But the man behind it was not a villain. He was a hero. Susan felt tears streaming. She recalled the distrust she had felt just hours ago, how she had begun to see Richard as a murderer. Now, hearing that he might have been a reluctant participant in a twisted intelligence game, forced to kill Novak who was about to betray or sabotage a crucial operation, changed everything. The man handed her a battered envelope. He said it was left decades earlier in case Richard's old life ever caught up. If she was the one who found it, it meant Richard was gone, and she deserved to read his words. Susan's hands shook as she opened the envelope. It contained a letter, dated 1970, scrawled in Richard's, or Daniel's, hand. The letter read, "My dearest Susan, if you ever find this, it means the shadows I fled have found me, or I've left this world before explaining. I wish I could have told you more, but I could not endanger you. Yes, I took another man's identity. I ended his life. I had no choice. His final act threatened countless innocent lives. I never forgave myself for the blood on my hands. But I had to vanish. My new life with you was my only solace. My love for you was my only truth. Forgive me for all I hid. You have always been my light." Reading those lines, Susan sobbed uncontrollably, her chest tight with a swirl of relief and heartbreak. The man at the table quietly placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He told her that many old veterans of that clandestine era considered Richard, or whomever he truly was, a man of quiet valor. The reason the official records were missing was because everything was sealed or purged to protect the ongoing network. He apologized that she had to learn it this way, explained they monitored her once she arrived in Prague, wanting to see if she'd uncover the truth or become a threat. Seeing her grief, they decided she deserved the real story. Susan, still trembling, felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Guilt that she had doubted him, sorrow for the lonely burden he carried, gratitude that he had chosen a life with her at all. She thanked the stranger, tears shining, her voice cracking as she asked, "He was not a murderer, was he?" The man gently shook his head. "He had to do terrible things for the greater good, but murder was never his intention. The Novak infiltration threatened many innocent souls. Your husband stepped in. He saved lives. I am living proof." Then he rose, left the photograph and letter with her, and vanished into the swirl of cafe patrons. Susan realized she might never know the entire labyrinth of that espionage, but at least she now grasped that her husband's hidden life had not been the monstrous betrayal she feared. She returned home a day later, calmer though her heart still ached. The letter never left her bag, and she frequently read it, gleaning new nuances from Richard's words. The longing, the regret at lying to her. She found a measure of closure in understanding his secrecy. It was not out of mistrust, but out of fear for her safety. She recognized the times he must have dreaded any sign that old foes might track him. His occasional nightmares, his reluctance to talk about the past, these took on new meaning. She spent hours in quiet reflection, looking at photos of them smiling on their wedding day, on the trip to Niagara Falls, or the birth of their son. All of it felt more precious, as she realized how each moment must have glowed for him, living under the constant weight of a stolen name and a dangerous secret. Once the tears subsided, she decided the truth needed to be shared with those who had questioned Richard's background. She reached out to a local veterans organization that had quietly asked about the suspicious lack of records. She explained in carefully chosen words that her husband had served in deep clandestine operations, that official records had been sealed or erased, and that he had, in fact, performed heroic feats during the Cold War. She withheld details about the killing of Novak, focusing instead on the fact that he had thwarted an assassination plot, saving countless lives. The organization, surprised and somewhat skeptical, eventually listened to her evidence. The letter, the testimonies from Prague. Over time, they recognized that the so-called missing records were indeed part of a secret network. They publicly validated Richard's memory as that of a hidden hero. The swirling rumors that he was a fake soldier or a cowardly con artist dissipated. In their place grew a quiet respect for the man who had given up everything to guard innocent lives. The community, learning bits and pieces, expressed admiration. Friends who had only known Richard as a gentle retiree felt both stunned and proud. Many told Susan it must be hard to discover so late, but they praised Richard's moral courage. She found relief that no one turned on him with condemnation. Instead, people responded with supportive warmth, offering condolences anew, as if she had lost him twice. First to illness, then to the illusions of secrecy. She felt both grief and gratitude, forging a new sense of closeness with neighbors who realized she was processing a complicated mourning. Months passed. Each day, she grew more at peace with her husband's hidden life. She gave away some of his old clothes, kept his personal trunk of documents locked but labeled, in case their son ever wanted to learn the full story. She debated whether to share the details with him now or wait until he was older. In the end, she told him the broad strokes, that his father had served in a clandestine capacity, had done good in dangerous circumstances, and that the official records were gone for important reasons. Her son, though shocked, accepted it, content to recall the father he knew, a man of kindness who taught him to fish and fix a broken shelf. The father who read him bedtime stories, never letting him sense the storms brewing in his mind. Susan felt a subtle calling to revisit Prague, not to chase more revelations but to properly celebrate Richard's legacy. She contacted the mysterious man who had approached her, leaving a message at the cafe's phone number he had scribbled on a slip of paper. He eventually replied with a warm invitation to join some old intelligence colleagues in a quiet memorial for Richard. She boarded a plane, heart fluttering, carrying only a small suitcase and the treasured letter. This second trip felt different, no longer haunted by confusion, but guided by a desire for closure and gratitude. She arrived in Prague, noticing how the city glowed in spring. Blooming flowers in window boxes, sunshine on the Vltava. She felt lightness in her chest, imagining Richard's presence, perhaps seeing the city through his eyes. The man, who never gave her his real name, only an alias, greeted her near Charles Bridge, leading her through narrow cobblestone lanes to a discreet courtyard. There, a small group of older men and women waited, some in worn coats, some with canes. They greeted Susan with gentle smiles, tears in their eyes. One woman, with silver hair and stern features, said she owed Richard her life. Another man claimed Richard's final infiltration saved his entire family from an assassination attempt. They each shared anecdotes Susan had never dreamed existed. Her husband, or the man once called Daniel Novak, had orchestrated crucial warnings that changed the fate of many local activists. They insisted he was no heartless killer, but someone who stepped in at an impossible crossroads, making the only choice to avert mass bloodshed. The real Novak, they explained, had gone rogue, compromised by foreign operatives. Richard tried to bring him back to reason, but it ended tragically. Susan listened, tears flowing as they recounted small but powerful stories, how Richard had provided coded intel. She realized these people saw him as a hero, a man who gave up any chance of publicly receiving medals or praise. He had found his only reward in the quiet life he built with her. They toasted to him with wine, placed a small plaque in the courtyard acknowledging a forgotten savior of Prague's hidden war. She wept, touched beyond words, feeling the final piece of her heartbreak mended. The man who once introduced himself to her in the cafe handed her a single white rose, murmuring, "He always said you were his greatest happiness." As twilight settled over the city, Susan walked along the bridge, gazing at the reflection of lamplights dancing on the river, warm tears on her cheeks. She felt Richard's love in every breath of the breeze. She realized that while the secrets he kept had caused her confusion and pain, they were born not of betrayal but of necessity and devotion. The fear that he had deceived her maliciously dissolved. Instead, she saw him as someone forced by cruel circumstances to assume a life, to hide a tragic but heroic act, and to preserve the chance for ordinary love. She thought about how many nights he must have lost sleep, weighed down by memories of that fateful moment with Novak. Returning home after that second trip, she felt renewed. She placed the letter from the man in Prague and all the relevant documents in a small locked cabinet, labeling them carefully. She wrote a note to her son. "If you ever want the deeper truth, it's here. Just know your father was a good man." She realized that while she carried sorrow for the illusions that had shrouded their marriage, she also carried an immense pride in him. He had not been the man who murdered Daniel Novak selfishly. He had, in some dire moment, stopped a monstrous plan saving many. The hush that followed was a moral burden he chose to carry in silence. At church the following Sunday, she lit a candle in Richard's memory, praying for final absolution. She felt in her bones that he was forgiven. The gossip that once swirled about him possibly falsifying his army service records died away, replaced by quiet, unspoken respect. People noticed a new serenity in Susan's demeanor, though they couldn't guess the cause. Some nights, she dreamed of him, younger, wearing that half-obscured uniform, smiling faintly as he gently apologized for leaving her with so many questions. In these dreams, she responded, "I understand." And she meant it. She carried on teaching for a while, returning to her second-grade classroom. She poured an extra measure of compassion into every child, mindful that behind each face might lie secrets or pain, just as Richard's stoic face had hidden so much. Over the next year, she occasionally corresponded with the handful of Richard's old comrades in Prague. They sent her small tokens, a photograph of Richard in younger days, standing near an unknown border checkpoint, an old clipping referencing an incident averted. She sent back a photograph of him reading the newspaper on their front porch. Decades later, the same watchful intensity in his eyes. She felt both heartbreak and pride seeing him so at ease in that snapshot, a man who once navigated mortal danger halfway around the world. The final piece of closure arrived on a warm autumn day. She decided to hold a quiet memorial at a local park, inviting close friends and a few old acquaintances from his rumored intelligence circle. She read a short speech, acknowledging that she had discovered certain truths about Richard's past, about who he truly was. Without delving into morbid details, she praised him for the sacrifices he made, the lives he saved, the love he shared with her despite the weight of living under a borrowed name. Her voice shook with tears, but she pressed on. By the end, many present were weeping softly. In that moment, she felt Richard's presence like a gentle hush, approving. She placed a single rose by an oak tree in the park, symbolizing that his final resting place, though unknown, was in her heart. Stepping away from the gathering, she found her son standing quietly. He asked if she wanted to share more about the father he once thought was simply Richard Carter, retired Army. She nodded, taking him aside. For a short while, she confided the broader strokes. How his father had lived a life of secrets in a war overshadowed by the hush of clandestine operations. How he once had to do something terrible to prevent far greater tragedy. How each day afterwards was spent atoning for that. Her son listened with glistening eyes, then finally said, "I'm proud of him. I always was, but now even more." They embraced, tears merging grief and respect into a single, profound emotion. Susan felt the last of her burdens ease. In the months that followed, she considered traveling again, maybe to the places Richard once spoke of, half-truth though they might have been. She realized she wanted to see West Germany, maybe stand near a border post from the Cold War era. But her heart told her she had done enough searching. She had confronted the illusions, found the hidden compassion behind them, and honored his memory. She decided to let the rest be. She was content now in her quiet suburban house, teaching children to read and count, cherishing their giggles. Sometimes, late at night, she reread his letter. "My love for you was my only truth." She wept, but it was not sorrow alone. There was deep gratitude as well. The city of Prague remained a place she had come to associate with heartbreak and revelation. But in her mind, it had become a second home. She dreamed sometimes of strolling those cobblestones with Richard's arm looped in hers, showing him the wonders he once only experienced under the shadow of espionage. She liked to imagine them sipping coffee in a bustling square, not as ex-agent or stolen name, but as a simple retired couple on vacation. She believed in a small corner of heaven. Perhaps that scenario played out in spirit. The letter assured her of his love, and that was enough. Finally, Susan reached a day when she realized she had no more tears for the deception, only tears for the love she had lost too soon. She lived her daily life with a renewed sense of purpose, grateful that, whatever his name or past, Richard had given her decades of genuine devotion. She told her closest friend, "He was exactly who I hoped, a man worthy of my devotion, even if he never got to tell me the whole story." That friend smiled, placing a hand on her arm, saying she admired how Susan carried herself. And so the shadow that had once threatened to crush her with doubt transformed into an enduring warmth, the knowledge that she had discovered the deeper truth. Instead of shattering her love, it had enriched it, revealing the quiet heroism behind Richard's hush. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.